This is going to be quite difficult for a number of reasons. One is there are traffic lights at the back, and people like me see that as a chance to jump. The other thing is I've just come back from China with a fairly dreadful cough, so forgive the water, but I'm going to be taking sips. And the final thing is that Robert has now skillfully pinched one precious paragraph out of what I was going to say. And it was hard enough to write stuff that had to last 2.5 hours as it was. Let me start by saying that Leander Club holds a very special position in the rowing world. And in common with most large institutions, it has clearly had its ups and downs. From being referred to as the cock of the water in the early 19th century, it continued to enjoy a glorious history for well over a century, only to be completely overtaken, both on and off the water. By the time the last half of the 20th century arrived, it was, in honesty, a faded power in a fading clubhouse. What I have to say today will not involve a long list of the club's phenomenal success on the water. I left a pause there for you all to say hooray. That success is very clearly documented in the previous club history, entitled The Brilliance, and of course will be updated in the book that we're publishing to celebrate our bicentenary next year. Now I have to say The Brilliance was not a great read, despite being written by two eminent rowing journalists. Maybe that was the reason. It conveniently airbrushed anything that might be considered inconvenient from its pages. But there we go. I would also say that I'm sure most of the people in this room have visited Leander and have had a chance to see for themselves our victories, which are very well displayed on the acres and acres of honours boards that line the corridors of our clubhouse. I think any club that's won 124 Olympic medals doesn't have to justify its position. I'm the first to know that every win is the result of very hard work and dedication, and every win is special too. But today you'll hear the history of not what we did, but how we did it. I should also make it very clear that what I have to say today is just one man's account of Leander's extraordinary recent journey, which over the last 40 years I think one can say has seen the resurrection of Leander Club. Once a little ancient history is out of the way, the journey we're going to take together starts just prior to my arrival at Leander as a young graduate. Please understand that this is not an attempt to convince you that I was anything more than just one of the many who have contributed to Leander's progress. In truth, I've had very little to do with Leander's success on the water, and that is surely the benchmark by which Leander is judged. However, as Robert's explained, I have been there throughout the last 40 plus years, 10 years on the committee and 24 years as an officer of the club. So I've been in a unique position to have seen what went on. But I stress this is not an official history. It's my observations. Before I get to the last 40 years, I'd like to touch briefly on the long-term history of our sport. Without an appreciation of how rowing became a sport, it's very hard to comprehend what has changed and why. I wish I'd heard all of Peter Mallory's talk. There may be some repetition here. I came in halfway through because I had a meeting this morning, but I hope this won't be too dull. Just turn the clock back 500 years roughly, and rowing in significant numbers was simply a profession followed by the watermen on the River Thames in London. In the Middle Ages, the concentration of watermen lay on the London River, as for those that could afford it, the River Thames was the chosen east-west route through the city and vice versa. The alternative was a very difficult journey by horse through impossibly crowded, dangerous, and frankly, filthy streets. It is simply inevitable that the watermen would race each other, and many competitions were staged for them, the most famous being the Doggett's Coat and Badge, which is still raced for annually at the end of the summer, 303 years later. Come the end of the 18th century, and I hope that gives you renewed hope that I am sprinting through this, the River Thames, particularly above the Pool of London, offered an opportunity for recreation alongside its operation as a working river. I heard Peter actually refer to this, so if we've both said that, it may be right. This is the key issue. It was a place of recreation for those few who could afford it, gentlemen of means. It was these gentlemen who hired boats under the tutelage of professional watermen, raced each other, often for money, on the River Thames. Now, by the 1820s, the sport was being practiced at Eton, and thus found its way to the universities of Oxford and Cambridge shortly afterwards. But make no mistake about it, this was a sport for the wealthy, and such was the gulf separating the working man and the gentleman, that in competition terms, this voyage remained strictly enforced well into the 20th century, as many of us remember. Reading Working Man's Regatta, for example. Oof. I'm here today to talk about a small recent section of Leander's history. It represents less than a quarter of Leander's history. There are those here today far better qualified than me to cover the history of our sport, but the message remains that this was a sport of gentlemen. The influential centres of rowing remained at the well-known public schools and, of course, at Oxford and Cambridge. Thus, Leander's crews in the Victorian era were drawn predominantly from Oxford and Cambridge, which gave them a source of the finest rowers in the land, and this stood Leander in good stead. They were golden years, with Leander winning the Grand Challenge Cup 8 times in the last decade of the 19th century. And at this stage, you might be interested to know that membership of Leander stood at 800. It was not a small club even then. Now, if I'm ever to get to the last 40 years, I'm forced to make sweeping generalizations, and I shall do just that. Leander's first real knock to its supremacy was to find its prowess challenged by bloody foreigners. The Belgians, the Dutch, and the Americans, to name but 3. The next major change to hit Leander was a social one. We've built up a picture of an establishment sport dominated by the public schools in Oxbridge. And I just pause for a moment and say it's interesting to note, however, that at the top of their respective pyramids, these privileged organizations continue to excel. Just watch the boat race. I know there's someone here who doesn't want to, but the rest of us love it. Or Eton, or Abingdon, or anyone like that in the final of the PE, and you will appreciate just how good they are at their sport. But lower down the pyramid, particularly at universities, there's been a massive dilution of standards, and thus of competitive success. The social change I referred to is complex, but examples are that the colleges of Oxford and Cambridge started to select their students not on the school they'd attended, but on their academic ability. Oxbridge was no longer the reserve of public school boys alone, and the experienced rowing population diminished. The result of this was that college rowing fell in standard and was soon to be overtaken by the provincial rowing clubs, where membership was much more egalitarian, and theoretically, those who raced, it was based simply on performance. Until this time, well, in fact, well into the 70s, by far the vast majority of Leander's members were drawn from Oxford and Cambridge. The qualifications in those days were loaded in favour of such people. A trial cap would see you qualify, as would doing well in the bumps. And if you look at Leander's membership today, it still enjoys huge support from members elected from this era. When I tell you that the average age of a Leander member is 62, you will realise that this is something of a challenge for the club. It's not what I would choose for a business model. However, the club recognised that college rowing was becoming of a lower and lower standard, and a philosophy of membership qualification grew based on the premise that it was offensive to our hard-training athletes to share membership with someone who might have simply performed well in a collegiate race. Today, our members are drawn from all sectors of the rowing world. remarkably few from Oxford and Cambridge. We do attract some of the Blue Boat and things like that, but collegiate rowers stand little chance of reaching the required standard to meet that phrase which is enshrined in our rules, proficiency in oarsmanship. Oxbridge was not simply providing a rich vein for membership. It had also supplied many of our rowers, and this too had to change. A young man coming down from his college first boat, even if it was head on the river, was simply not of a competitive standard to fight his corner at an open regatta. In the 1960s, under the captaincy of Peter Sutherland, who many of you will know, with the help of John Hall Craggs, they set up the Leander Cadet scheme. This scheme opened the boathouse doors, incidentally it did not open the doors upstairs, to all comers, mainly school leavers, to come down, row at Leander on a trial basis. If they liked you, they kept you. If they didn't, they sent you packing. The scheme worked in terms of bringing young, fresh talent to the club, and it came of age in 1967 when Donald Leggett persuaded Derek Drury, who'd just started work at Shiplake College, just the other side of the lock, to come and coach the cadets. Such is the influence of a great coach, and it was Derek who was responsible for those superb Emmanuel School crews. Such was the influence that Leander won the Thames Cup, and in those days that was a very hard event to win. Very different system to what it is now. Still hard, but different. The club's first great athlete of the second half of the 20th century was born in the form of one of my personal heroes, Tim Crooks, who rowed at the sixth seat in that eight. It was under the auspices of the cadet scheme that I arrived at the club in 1973. My rowing career was pretty insignificant. I have to say that because one of the trustees of the River and Row Museum was one of the coaches at the club when I was there, so I can't embellish my modest achievements. Yes, and thank you for that, Howard. I appreciate it and all the work you did. The climate at Leander was a strange one. You trained hard, you rowed a lot by the standards of the day, but you were not made a member of the club unless you were selected to compete at Henley Royal Regatta in Leander colours. Even then, this was only done because HRR insisted that all competitors had to be members of the club they were rowing for. Seems reasonable enough, doesn't it? Now, there were, tragically, people who never quite made it and spent 2 or 3 years rowing at the club, didn't make the cut, and thus never became members. So there was quite an incentive. But Leander was once again going through a difficult period. This time it was financial. There had been generations of neglect of the clubhouse, and the finances were very difficult. It was very hard for the committee to balance the books. They were as generous as they could be to rowing, but the club was not going to move on. A series of events led to an uncomfortable battle between the established committee under the leadership of John Garton and a group of revolutionaries, of which I have to admit to being one. The battle reached a climax in 1983 when the incumbent committee resigned en masse and a new committee was elected under the presidency of the great Kenneth Payne. This was probably the most painful period in Leander's long history. The club then set about financial recovery, and progress was reasonably quick, which enabled a new emphasis to be put on rowing. Many people have asked me, well, 2 actually, when I look back at my years in the club, what were the most significant moments? Emotionally, it was particular victories achieved by our crews, as that's why one does it. It's what rowing's all about. It's why we volunteer, isn't it? And an example of that would be Leander winning the Ladies' Plate in 1985. You might expect me to mention an Olympic event or the Grand, but no, because that was a club event and it showed we could do it. Equally, when the women won the first pennant at the head of the river race, a great moment for Leander, and my scalp goes tight as I talk about things like that. But analytically, the significant moments are not about those victories. They're about people, individual people, And it's the people who make the difference, and it's the people that I will talk about really during the rest of my talk. Now, by 1985, the club was making good progress. We could pay our bills, and we were beginning to consider even a renovation of the clubhouse. And then a key decision was made, and that was to appoint an inspirational captain in the form of Ivor Lloyd. Ivor and I rode together for fun, and he had the right balance of enthusiasm and knowledge, having been part of the GB team, but he remained at heart a club rower, and he had a good feel for what we needed to do. The next breakthrough was to get Mike Spracklen. Now, of course, I didn't know Mike was going to be here today. I'm not going to change what I wrote. Mike will probably never talk to me again. I apologize for what I'm about to say, Mike. Mike is surely one of the best coaches this country has ever seen. And for Mike to come and coach at Leander was just fantastic. It did, of course, have the added benefit that Steve Redgrave arrived at the club. But that was down to Mike too. And I must pause because I can't continue with addressing an issue which dogs Leander's role in rowing. Take Steve as an example. Steve was and always will be a Marlow man. No one wants to take that away from him. And just look at what he's done for Marlow since their fire, and you'll understand that comment. Leander, just like the other high-performance centres, attracts ambitious athletes from other clubs where they don't have enough people better than they are to row with, and the coaching that they aspire to. That is our role. That is the role of all the high-performance centres. It's to bring these brilliant people together, these ambitious, overachieving people together, and mould them into a team and help them on their journey to represent GB. That is our aim. I am the first to admit that it is of course uncomfortable for the club that feels it's lost that athlete, and I understand that. When our athletes are publicly introduced, I asked a few years ago that we start introducing them with the names of their home club first, and this is now becoming the norm. Leander wants to recognise the club that got that athlete to a level that enabled them to have the choice to seek to row at a higher level. That's how it works. A small aside, because I think we're roughly sort of 1987 now. And am I clear at the back, by the way? Good. Just to show you, I was honorary secretary of the club at the time, and the word secretary of a club is misconstrued in London. They think you sort of, you're the chief executive. I got a phone call at my office, and in those days one had a secretary who put these things through, and she said, it's Garrard's the Crown Jewellers. I thought I'd take that one. So, Mr. Randall, yes. Are you the secretary of the Leander Club? Yes. Well, something remarkable has happened, Mr. Randall. We were going through the vaults under Regent Street, and we have found a rose bowl with Leander's name on it. Now, those of you who know me will not be surprised to know that I said, the missing rose bowl. And they seemed very relieved when I said this. They said, well, we found it. Isn't that marvellous? I said, I'd love to see it. And they said, well, it's a disgusting state, so we'll get it cleaned up, and perhaps you'd care to come and collect it. I said, well, when would be convenient? They said, well, sort of Monday morning, about 11 o'clock, come to the back of the store in Golden Lion Square, or whatever it is, and we'll sort it out. So I turned up in my car, I was taken into the silver department, met the guy and everything else, presented with this simply fabulous solid silver rose bowl that needed about 3 people to put it in the boot of my car. And the director of the silver department says to me, it is remarkable that you recognise it because it's been in store since 1939 when war broke out. Now, of course, when I got it home and read the inscription, it said something about HMS Leander, which took an awful lot of polishing out. But it has pride of place in our clubhouse, so I do have my uses. I want to get back to our timeline. The season of 1988 saw a fantastic Henley Royal Regatta for Leander, and such was the Spracklen effect that we won the Grand, the Stewards, and here again, club man, Really significantly, we made the final of the ladies' plate with a young club crew. At last, we had some talent in depth, and that's really what we've been waiting for. The following year, and I can be corrected now because Mike's here, I've just written there was a falling out between difficult characters at the ARA, which forced the brilliant Mike Spracklin, God, I overdid it about Mike, didn't I, to seek new pastures. And sadly, we lost him to the Canadian national team. I'm in no doubt that Mike should have got the top job as GB coach. It would have been great for Great Britain. But it was not to be. An example of letting irreplaceable talent slip through your fingers. There was great disillusionment with the squad system rowing at Hammersmith at that time, and many of the internationals were choosing to row at Leander. And both GB and Leander were left with a huge hole that needed filling. And by the way, welcome home, Mike. It was at this time that another huge character arrived at Leander in the form of Matthew Pinsent. I don't need to dwell on the success that he enjoyed rowing in partnership with Steve. It's the stuff of legends. And I promised you I would not simply list our results. Matthew's character added so much to Leander. He remained totally approachable to everyone in the changing room, whatever their level, and I still shudder when I remember what he could do to an ergometer. Meanwhile, it says here evolution, but I think it means revolution. Meanwhile, revolution was back on the menu, but this time it was not Leander facing revolt, but the ARA. We did consider taking it over. That's how brave we were in those days, but we didn't. Basically, a meeting was held at Leander in February 1990 when 19 significant club captains attended a meeting there, which resulted in them expressing their combined dissatisfaction of the Amateur Rowing Association, notably for their alleged mismanagement of the finances. The governing body of our sport was, it must be said, in some disarray. And at the end of 1990, the club was able to make its move in recruiting the very talented Jürgen Grobler from East Germany to coach at Leander. He started in January 1991. I shall be forever grateful to all the people, Ian Wilson from Nottingham being one, who helped make that happen. This was a simply huge step for the club. It wasn't a question of just getting Jürgen, because we didn't completely know what we were getting. But we had to buy a house for him. This is a club, remember, that had been struggling financially relatively short time before that. We had to buy a house, we had to find a school for his son, Christian, a job for his wife, Angela. I mean, it was a sea change for Leander. And we were beginning to spend at a new level, and I have to say, it frightened many amongst us. Jürgen's effect was formidable. Even though he was, I'll be polite here, less than impressed with our rowing facilities, he brought with him a degree of professionalism that was new to rowing in this country. It was sometimes hard to keep up with his demands. They were reasonable, but tested the resolve of Leander to row at this very high level. It soon became clear, though, that Jürgen could only achieve his full potential if he had control of the whole GB team. And it was a great day for both Leander and British rowing when we released him from his contract after the Barcelona Olympics in 1992, allowing him to become GB's chief coach. Remember, there was no Caversham at this time, and so we were lucky that he continued to centre his activities at Leander, and obviously he was an amazing magnet. Just a few years later, in 1996, another great architect of Leander's prowess, rowing prowess, arrived at the club in the form of Bryan Armstrong. Now, you'll very rarely see Bryan standing where I'm standing now. Bryan is the ultimate backroom boy, but so talented, so good at what he does, and such a hard worker. He had just retired as GB team manager after the Atlanta Olympics, and he brought incredible knowledge and also a great volunteer work ethic to Leander. And we so much of what our club does relies on volunteers. Over 20 years on, Bryan continues to lead our building projects and chairs the rowing management group, a key role in the club.